This is the Fire These Times, and I'm your host, Elia Ayoub. Hello everyone, welcome to the Fire These Times. My name is Elia Ayoub, and I'll be your host today and all days. Today I'm joined by Romeo Kokriatski and Mariam Naiem, two recurrent guests on the pod, and we will be talking about, Ukraine. I mean, the title is going to be pretty obvious by now. The way I figured I'd do this, Mariam recently came back from Ukraine. The three of us did an episode in December, I think, December or November, which got a lot of views and listens, whatever, and attention. Clearly, people seem to have engaged with it in a way that I find productive and healthy, which is not that common on the internet these days. So that was nice. Obviously, the topic was heavy, and the topic will be heavy today. So, the usual content warnings, I suppose. But the main thing I want to talk about is, a bunch of stuff. First, I guess just to start ourselves, would it be okay for you to introduce yourselves for those who have not listened to previous episodes? Maybe we can start with Mariam and then Romeo.
Hi, my name is Mariam Naiem, and this is the most annoying part of any podcast for me. I don't know how to present myself. I was studying culture, and this is basically my main job right now to talk about culture in a different perspective. And of course, since the big invasion, I'm very curious on the topic of colonialism and imperialism in the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Yeah, so that's it.
Romeo?
Hi, listeners. I'm Romeo Kokriatski. I'm the managing editor of the New Voice of Ukraine, Ukraine's premier English language news source. So if you're looking for news about Ukraine in English, check out nv.ua. On top of that, I'm also a journalist in my own right and the host of Ukraine Without Hype, which is a bi-weekly podcast on all things Ukraine, but focusing on the news and the biggest headlines in the region.
And I listen to every episode because I'm amazing. Okay, so let's... Thank you, Kobe. Same here. Okay. I think I'm preemptively making jokes with myself because I know that the subject of our conversation is going to be a bit heavy. But listeners of this podcast, I'm assuming maybe have gotten used to it by now. And just before recording, I was listening to another episode. First, I listened to the most recent episode of Ukraine Without Hype, but also I listened to this episode by a podcast called Talk Eastern Europe. About a book that was published by a person called Megan Busky, who is like Ukrainian American. And the title of the book is Ukraine is Not Dead Yet, A Family Story of Exile and Return. And I later learned, I mentioned in the conversation that sentence is apparently part of the national anthem of both Ukraine and of Poland. And there's some kind of historical sources that said that the Ukrainian one was partly inspired by the Polish one, but whatever. But this sentence kind of really struck me, and I think struck also the podcast host because they kind of focused on it at the beginning of that conversation, because it sort of feels that there's still a constant need on the part of Ukrainians, or at least they probably feel that need. And again, this is a very generalized impression, to remind the rest of the world that Ukraine is here, Ukraine is still here, Ukraine wants to remain here, and Ukraine is fighting the good fight, basically. I.e. that, and this is a bit of a repetition from the previous conversation, but I think we're going to take it in a different direction, that I have been sensing a deep cynicism from, quote-unquote, the rest of the world, focusing on the West here, especially, towards Ukraine, despite aid, being sent, weapons and whatnot. So nominally, the West is on Ukraine's side, with some caveats here and there, like Hungary or whatever. But there seems to be a difference of, or I don't know how I would describe it, but like the urgency doesn't seem to be the same. Ukrainians have been, for the most part, pretty consistent from the beginning, especially since as Maya mentioned, like the big invasion, the most recent full-scale invasion. Obviously, the first one started in 2014. Have been pretty consistent about saying that this is an existential crisis. This is literally, we need to win. Otherwise, we will be destroyed. Like, it's pretty straightforward. Whereas in a lot of the discussions that I've seen elsewhere, like especially in Europe and kind of like Anglo press, like US, UK, there isn't always there's often not a mention of the fact being an existential threat. There's a mention of like the strategic what this might mean to Europe, what this might mean to America, that sort of thing. I wonder if we can just start with me asking your impression as to the sort of responses that we've been seeing since, maybe even since we chatted. Like I literally since in the past 4 months, if there have been, if you would say that there has been any changes, and if not, like I'm just curious to hear your thoughts as a way of, just kickstarting this conversation.
Okay, first of all, I think I will just give the personal expression of my feeling. After that, I will answer that question. It's very curious that with time, of course, and this was understandable from the very beginning, and to be honest, I didn't expect it to be different, but you knew that at some point the amount of information about Ukraine will decrease, and it was kind of obvious that it will happen. So with the time, you can see that there is less and less information about Ukraine, but you are feeling worse and worse.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like, so people became less and less concerned and kind of more relaxed and they have less tension, that less thoughts about third world war, about nuclear threat or something like that. But you are genuinely with each day, you're more fucked. And you have feeling like this is something you can feel like it's already, if it before was kind of on the surface of your body, on the surface of your skin, now it's kind of part of your bones. And the gap between you and the rest of the world, between you and Ukrainians, because you don't live in Ukraine, it's also another part of the tragedy, I guess. The amount of people they don't spend time with their relatives or they're not together. Yeah, it just insane. Like you basically see how people continue to live, to move on, but with every day you feel like you're drowning, and of existential crisis it just became bigger and bigger. So this is from the personal point of view, and this is of course like, for example, at my work I have a feeling like, okay, it was 1 year of war, and now Mariam, you should be productive again. But I feel worse. Like it's not like I'm stabilized. You cannot stabilize here. So, and nobody, and you also have a feeling. I felt like that after death of my father, that you kind of have a social norm for grief. Like, okay, yeah, you were sad about 1 year, it's enough. Now you should be productive. And this is the thing. Like, I kind of understood from this is again my perception, that okay, yeah, Mariam, 1 year you can be emotional. Sometimes it's hard for you to work, yes, but 1 year is past. Now you should need to, continue. And then, of course, like my biggest fear is like I don't know how long it will be, and I don't know what I will feel with time, and of course other Ukrainians. So this is first thing, and about the about world and the reaction and how it's kind of uh, less of a topic right now. I have also I kind of understood, kind of solved the puzzle for me, because I was like, why people don't understand that we won't exist if Russia became if Russia wins. I kind of have the answer right now. I think it's because people think, as since the state is a social construct as everything, people think that in case Russia will have power in Ukraine, it just changing of the flag. It will be just the same, just you just changing the flag. Basically, I have a feeling that some people assume that Ukrainians fighting for the myth, because it actually doesn't make any sense. Wherever, what it's not even important what country it is. And I think that there's a big problem. And I'm not talking right now about some philosophical ideas or moral or something like that. No, I'm talking about like very grounded stuff. People don't understand that Ukrainians that were captured or that lived on occupied territory, a lot of them were killed. It's not just changing flag. We were like, there are people who, especially men, of course, or people with very active pro-Ukrainian position, they are killed by Russians. It's not like, okay, you can live here, we're just changing flag, just live your life, be Ukrainians, wherever. No, it's actually death threat. Like, we won't exist as a people, as a human being, because they're killing Ukrainians with pro-Ukrainian position. And this is like known fact. So I think it's kind of also important to highlight that it's not a changing flag, a changing state. It's basically, we know for sure that if you have pro-Ukrainian position, you will be killed if you are living on occupied territory.
And I think it's important to highlight that this pro-Ukrainian position isn't just like, it's not a political position. It's literally existing while Ukrainian, being allowed to even use the word Ukraine or Ukrainian when describing yourself. And the Russians are and have been since the very beginning of the full-scale invasion. They've been incredibly explicit that their goal is to wipe out the very concept of Ukraine. Like, they go out in public on their TV or whatever, on the radio, they write articles in their newspapers where they keep repeating, we want to destroy all Ukraine. All of Ukraine needs to be destroyed, which in practice means killing everyone who like speaks Ukrainian, has Ukrainian culture, identifies as Ukrainian, just pure, outright, and explicit genocide. But I think Miriam's right that a lot of people in the West just see it like, oh, this is the post-Soviet sphere. They were all Russian before. They should just all be Russian again. I know there's a lot of people in Germany that think like this, like, oh, what are these silly Ukrainians worrying about? They clearly Ukrainians lived during the Soviet Union. So if Russia like wins, Europe gets their economy back, and who cares? The Ukrainians will be around. But that's obviously not true, since the Russians quite explicitly want to murder us all. There's no real negotiations or whatever to have with the Russians, because their explicit goal, repeated over and over again, is to destroy the very concept of Ukraine. People typically don't like having their identity, language, their culture disappear. If during the Soviet Union you had, centuries of colonialism for people to like rationalize the Russianization of their family or their culture or whatever, after 30 years of independence, that's no longer an option. People are not just going to say, oh, yeah, I guess we're Russian. Not to mention that Russia is just a worse country. Like, we're neighbors. We can look with our eyes how people live there, the attitudes they have, the way their society is like structured and functions, and we don't want that. Even the most pro-Russian Ukrainian politician would at least have to pretend, make some signs towards Europe. I mean, the reason we had the Maidan, arguably the full-scale invasion at all, is because Yanukovych went back on his word to integrate more into Europe, which was popular with the entire population, pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, apathetic, whatever. Everyone wanted to be a part of Europe and not a part of Russia. And that's not going to change. So it's like this, quite frankly, parochial attitude of, Ukrainians are complaining too much. They need to negotiate. There needs to be a peace. There's endless violence, is just really demeaning to people that are facing explicit genocide and constant aggression.
Thanks a lot for that. The point that Mariam made about it being like nation states being social constructs, and how this can play into a sort of a what's the word I'm looking for? Like a devaluing of serious situations like the one in Ukraine. I've always had I've had the impression, especially since the full-scale invasion, but I think this is something that dates like predates it as well, that in the countries that I've experienced right now, Switzerland, the UK, before that, a bit of the US and whatnot, there is a sense of stability that is taken for granted. And by stability, I don't mean like everything's gonna be fine, or like there's no economic crisis, or obviously the UK had Brexit, Trump, all of that stuff. It's not like stability means everything's gonna be fine forever and we'll all be safe and whatnot. But there does seem to be an assumption that the place where we live will not be destroyed, will not be invaded. This is especially true of Switzerland, right? The one that was neutral in both world wars and whatnot. And this is something that I'm still kind of wrapping my head around. because I come from a country that was destroyed a bunch of times and is always at risk of being destroyed once again. So the fact that that is possible, there's this term anticipation of violence in the literature, is something I take for granted when it comes to my own, to Lebanon, basically, and also to the region more broadly, to be honest. So as soon as I saw that kind of existential fear in the way Ukrainians were talking, especially since the most recent, since the past year, basically, that's when it clicked to me almost instantly that this is what it is, essentially. That I didn't have this kind of ideological filter, if you want, that comes with a certain amount of comfort that one might take for granted. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that if you are Swiss or British or American or French or whatever, a Westerner, that you would automatically have that kind of attitude, or that your assumptions are such. Obviously, I don't want to simplify, I don't want to be overly simplistic, but I think it just says, it speaks a bit to, at least to a significant extent, it speaks to this generally seems to be a different sense of urgency. Even like, let's say, the American government or whatnot, the EU says all the right things, let's say, which isn't even the case, but let's say they do. Even the tone isn't the same compared to like a Ukrainian politician or just like an average Ukrainian activist, journalist, or just a random civilian. There is a sense of, I don't know how to explain it, and it's partly maybe it explains why there's also been this West-East European divide in terms of reacting to the invasion, and how fast one side has been compared to the other, even though the resources aren't even the same. Thinking of Poland or Latvia or whatnot, because of this different historical experience. But all of this to say that if Mariam, you mentioned before, like you did expect, for example, that at some point there would be, not to put words in your mouth, but if I understood correctly, a quote-unquote war fatigue, and I'm putting this in quotation, i.e. from the press in the West especially, but also honestly in the rest of the world, with the exception of the Russian press, which is its own kind of phenomenon, and obviously the Ukrainian press, which is most directly impacted by what's happening. There is a sense of like, well, why isn't this thing done yet? Why are we still covering it or whatnot? And it's rarely mentioned this explicitly, although from time to time you'll have a politician here and there that says so, in Europe especially. I'm not gonna say why do you think that is. I mean, feel free to try and answer that if you want. But more the question I wanted to ask is, what's the sense that you have from other Ukrainians, from yourself and other Ukrainians, towards that problem? Like, is this seen as something that can be tackled, can be changed? Like, is it just all changing the hearts and minds of Europeans and Americans or whatever, other folks, or is it a matter of, actually we recognize that, because it feels that there's a bit of that as well. Like, we recognize that the investment that they have towards us, for lack of a better term, may not be long term. Therefore, we need to make the most of it, as fast as we can. I'm thinking especially of like Zelensky in the early days, basically being very forthcoming in the sense like, we need this, we need this, we need this, like very, very straightforward, in a way that I'm personally not familiar. I haven't seen this in politicians in general. Anyway, that's a lot of stuff. Feel free to take it for wherever you want, and I'll try and organize my thoughts to be slightly more coherent.
I think after 9/11, something changed drastically in the perception of the safety of the Western world. The idea of the terrorism basically is not about we need to kill as much people as we can. No, the idea of terrorism is not about we need to kill all people. The main purpose of terrorism, and I think it kind of worked well. I mean, of course, it's ironically, West has this privilege to feel safe, so let's take it away from them. Which was exactly start with 9/11, which exactly started with the wave of the terrorist attack in Europe. At some point, as you remember, it was in Paris, it was I think in Italy, I think so, I don't remember exactly. But I remember it was also kind of a discussion between our friends when we were like in touristic place in Spain. Oh, it's kind of a good spot right now for terrorist attack. I think it's kind of a very good example of how West forgot about that there is very different understanding or image of being safe and what is So the idea, the concept of safety, or just the idea that you're sure that your body won't be ruined by bomb, or by you won't be killed. I think it's very privileged idea. I think if you want to compare, I think it's something similar. I remember I had this conversation with friends from it was class at MIT, and there was only girls. There were only girls, and I remember I was saying them that in Europe, when when parents um, let their daughters go to university, they don't assume they will get raped. Like there is no moment when people think, where parents think, oh my god, my daughter is going to university, it means that she could be raped now. And they were so shocked by that, because it's already such a big construct in the society that this, like university, fraternity house, all of that is a big threat for women, and this is normal, like normal, so and I kind of, it was also very interesting to see how this idea of safety of women, for example, or rape culture is very different from kind of societies that kind of understand the same language. So I'm thinking it's very similar in a way, is that people don't remember. And here I don't want to, I don't like to use this esoteric stuff, and I'm not a very big fan of Jung or something, but I think in a way it can explain by also generation knowledge. I mean, my grandmother also didn't know what is safety, and and your relative as well. So and for example, I don't know, I can imagine that people in West, they feel more safety, their generation remember more safety than, for example, our generations, or generation in Ukraine, I mean. So I think it's also the idea that you're so lucky to think that safety, to be safe, is a baseline. I think that's why we have this problem. That's why I have a feeling that attitude towards Ukraine and to attitude towards war, it's like you have a mosquito in your room and you're just annoyed. Just like, can we do something with that? Again, I don't think that people genuinely are bad or something like that. I just think that there is a lot of, I just remember a day when I realized war will start. I wasn't denying. I wasn't like, I didn't think about that at all. And I just realized that Sunday that I'm pretty sure people before Second World War were saying the same. Like, nobody needs that. It's too much. And I realized, okay, this is exactly what I'm feeling, and I'm pretty sure it will happen. So I think it's very similar. Maybe our mind works that way, that you try to not think about that. That it's just a mosquito, just a small conflict. Because basically, if you look very deep into the conflict and very deep into the war, and you just forget about the countries and all of that, we were never so close to Third World War and nuclear wars as now. And this is like a big thing. And I think I have a feeling also that it's partly denial, like situation when everyone in West kind of in denial, to think that their world also can crumble in a second as ours. Because I remember I also said that once, that I have a feeling that some people in the West look at me and they basically scared to be us. And this is very interesting to feel like we are living through the hell that they're trying to avoid even thinking about. So I think it's both. It's first thing is that just um, uh, basically do not have the understanding that safety is privilege, and second is subconsciously maybe denying the idea that your safety is not forever.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly astute observation, that people are unwilling to face the fact that the kind of post-World War II order that the West has built and clings to is not permanent. I think that is like a legitimate fear that drives a lot of this Ukraine fatigue. More cynically, and especially on a political level, I also think there's, to put it bluntly, for a Western politician, it's not their constituents that are dying. Like for a European politician, Ukraine is like not exactly far away,
but Ukrainians are somewhere over there. Like the stories that come out of like Bucha and Mariupol and Izum, they're horrifying, of course, but they're somewhere over there. Like the same kind of attitude that you got in the 90s during the Yugoslav conflicts of even though like geographically Paris isn't all that far from Serbia, like Rome is literally across the sea. So it's like these people are close, but because this is all part of the post-Soviet world, politicians can brush this off as, well, these aren't our people. It's far away. My constituents care about like heating and gas prices, and the war is just interfering with that. And it's not like they're trying to be callous, but it's a consequence of, well, the fact that we have nation states that foreign politicians just don't care as much. And what's worse is if these foreign politicians decide they can win some points on Ukraine. One of the like biggest complaints that Ukrainians have raised since 2014, but especially since February last year, is that we aren't getting like materials quickly enough. That the West promises all this stuff, but we get it late, or we get it delayed, or we get it in some condition that's not able to use. Like just today, Germany confirmed that it delivered Patriots to Ukraine. Like over
today is April 19th, just for the record.
April 19th. So over a year since the war started. Now the Russians are nearly out of cruise missiles. The last mass missile attack was over a month ago. The Russians have said that they would stop targeting infrastructure, and they seem to have done that. Not because out of some goodwill gesture, but they physically just don't have enough missiles. So now that the Russians have basically run out of all the stuff that they can use to bomb us, they've bombed us. Now we get the really cool anti-air systems that we can park somewhere in Kiev and watch for the next missile attacks, which may come in 3 months or something, whenever the Russians finally manage to produce enough of them to launch at us. But it's late. And it's not the Patriots are just the example that happened today, but this has been the case for tanks. We still don't have jets. That whole like, please close our skies, protect our skies hashtag that was trending in the first days of the full scale invasion is still like, it was relevant then. It's still relevant now, but it seems like especially US politicians or the US government seems to be willing to let political consideration trump Ukrainian lives, because Ukrainian lives to them don't really matter. Again, Ukrainian lives don't vote. We have no like choice in whoever the next American president is going to be. If Trump wins again, it's going to be awful, but there's literally zero that Ukraine can do to influence that outcome. And Western politicians are completely weird. Like Macron was talking, the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, was talking up the Chinese so-called peace plan a couple of days ago. And the reason he did that is because the French typically want to be seen as this peaceful diplomatic power in the world. And look, we're gonna partner up with China, and we're gonna promote their peace plan, despite the fact that China's peace plan is literally just restating like Russian objectives without the explicit references to genocide. There's nothing of substance in China's so-called peace plan. But Western politicians are more than happy to use Ukrainian lives to win these points, to show that they're moderating, that they're pro-peace, that they want a swift resolution to this conflict, instead of just sending us the guns we ask for when we ask for them, so we can actually use them on time.
So hearing the both of you, a thought came to my mind that I think now I'm understanding a bit more why. Okay, let me put it this way: why I've been worried about something in particular you mentioned the Yugoslav wars, and obviously the genocide in Bosnia in the 90s. One difference between that, I mean, there are lots of, nothing is the same, but like one main difference between that conflict, quote unquote, and what's happening now in Ukraine is not just geographic proximity, because Ukraine borders the EU through Poland and whatnot, but the reaction by some states in the EU, namely Poland, Latvia, and so on, that seem to have understood early on, or at least like a good chunk of their constituents, let's put it that, like a good chunk of Poles and Latvians and whatnot, have understood early on that this is an existential threat, that this is something urgent. Now, in terms of government policy and whatnot, that tends to shift a lot. We've seen like the Poles even recently, I don't know what the details are, but like blocking cargo from Ukraine or something along those lines. With Yugoslavia, with Bosnia specifically, there was also the element of like the foreign other, Bosnian Muslims, are they really Europeans? There was that racism that I think it was Jean Baudrillard who had written this text about the genocide in Bosnia, basically arguing something along the lines of, and if I find it, I'll put it in the show notes, something along the lines of the Serbs are doing, like talking about the genocide, the Serbs are doing what many Europeans would like to do, but they can't do it, or they don't want to do it, so the Serbs are doing it for them. And that's why the condemnation, according to him, wasn't as as loud as it should have been. And I would argue that to this day, the genocide in Bosnia and the ongoing politics of the EU towards Bosnia, and which is something that I've gotten on, like I talked about on this podcast a couple of times with Edin Hajdarpazic and Aida Hozic, two separate episodes. But one of my worries is like the day after, and I know this is in many ways, it's kind of a privileged, theoretical, whatever, abstract way of thinking, because obviously I'm speaking to two Ukrainians, and the day after is such an abstraction at this point that I can only imagine. The reason I'm worried about it is that I've been following on and off the so-called Syrian war, which has been 90% of the time a war of extermination by the Assad regime against mostly civilians and occasionally rebels. In fact, the UN itself called it a war of extermination, which apparently is just the level below genocide, because these things have levels. And I'm already seeing today is sort of a normalization of the Assad regime. I mean, a normalization of the Assad regime. It doesn't always come in the form of like, exchanging ambassadors and raising the flag in Paris or whatever, but it does happen in accepting certain things indirectly. Like the UAE and now has renormalized ties with the Assad regime. Egypt always did. And so the West can sort of do certain things through their existing allies rather than doing so directly with Syria, because right now it's not politically tenable. And I saw already a version of that when it came to Russia, and, to a large extent still happening with, still taking Russian gas, of course. The comments here and there by certain politicians in the West, or like Western Europe or Eastern Europe, towards Ukraine or towards Russia, everything along the lines from either supporting Russia, which is not super common in terms of like mainstream politicians, but you do hear it here and there, and you hear it often before they get elected. Thinking of Meloni, for example, who's now the Prime Minister of Italy, was very obviously pro-Putin and now suddenly is not because she got elected. I'm putting this in quotation. But all of this to say, well, I'm mentioning all of this because I come from a country that, I come from the post-war generation, right? Like that's what they called us. I mean, they called us you had civil peace, and we are the civil war. So we are the civil peace generation in Arabic. That's what they would call us. And in many ways, my own research and studies and kind of what I do now, the PhD that I'm finishing on post-war Lebanon and cinema and trauma and whatnot, kind of cemented this idea in me that the post-war isn't really a post-war unless there is genuine attempts at transformative justice and justice in general and accountability and all of that stuff. And I tend to worry in these situations because we've seen so many recent examples from Iraq and Afghanistan, which are two obvious ones. Bosnia in many ways as well. There was some accountability when it came to Serbian war crimes, but honestly, for many cases, there isn't. And Republika Srpska which is an enclave within Bosnia, is in many ways the result of genocide, and it's it's a legal entity with its own thing and always has a separate militia and whatnot. But again, different topic. But I'm bringing all of this to say that there seems to be an acceptance within the status quo of the West or EU, maybe if you want to be more specific, I'm not sure. Although Bosnia, it's mostly Americans and Germans, to accept this sort of idea that we need negotiations and we need a trade-off, and the trade-offs are not something that they have to pay, right? Like the trade-offs are, in this case, what Ukrainians will have to pay. The trade-off is, okay, maybe we convince Putin to back off or whatever, but let him keep, I don't know, 10% and plus Crimea or whatever. And it's that sort of calculation, which again, we see it in op-eds, right? Like published in big publications in the West, in virtually all languages and whatnot. And it's seen as a respectable, quote unquote, position to have. And the fact that it is, the politics of respectability is something I'm quite interested in. The fact that it is something that can be said out loud, with maybe some pushback and whatnot, but it can be said, right? It's not beyond the bounds of respectability, or clearly you shouldn't say this because it's immoral or whatnot. The fact that it can be said tells me that there's a sort of a certain tolerance within these institutions, whether it's the EU, the US, or whatnot, to that kind of conclusion, because they still don't know what they want to do, or they still don't know what they want to get out of this conflict. They're just kind of this has been described, like the term managed the conflict has been used to describe the Americans when it comes to Israel Palestine for a long time. It's not about finding any kind of resolution. It's about like just managing, quote unquote, the conflict, just so that it doesn't get too worse too quickly or whatnot. And if it does, we push towards some kind of status quo, regardless of how harmful that status quo is to the local population, in this case Palestinians, or in the case of our topic, Ukrainians. And so I wonder if you have sort of wondered about that, or is it something that's just too far away in the future, and maybe even too optimistic, that it's not something that you really want to think about right now, which is also fine.
Yeah, it just a couple of days ago I was thinking about what I would like to do in future, and my partner asked me, yeah, okay, I got it, but what you will do without war? I mean, what will be your topic of interest? And it was so strange even to think about that, because I mean, I cannot imagine, and I know it's horrible to say, I cannot imagine this world without war. I mean, it's also the whole purpose of talking to you right now. It's only because of that, and the reason why I'm here. It's also only because of that. And I'm like, I cannot even imagine that. But it's also interesting. I remember it was at the very beginning. I talked to my friend, and I said that I'm pretty sure that in very end we will be like Frodo. We will be wounded until the end of our lives, and we will never, and our wound will never heal. And she said, I don't want to think about that. I want to think that we will be like Aragorn. I said, I hope to, but I don't believe in that. And with each day, I know that we are more like Frodo, and I just don't want to become Gollum, to be honest, at some point.
So just Mariam, for the non-geeks who are listening, the comparison is that Frodo was stabbed at one point, and that's in Lord of the Rings, obviously. And that stab was like is I don't know what the term was, but it wasn't like a normal stab, so it stayed with him forever, even after the big bad guy was defeated, Sauron. Whereas Aragorn had more of a healing journey in many ways, and then ended up becoming from this exiled ranger, whatever, to becoming this accepted king and whatnot. And Gollum, I guess, is the most extreme example of someone who completely succumbed to despair and all of that. So anyway, I just want to give some context.
Yeah, and also about
Not everyone's a nerd.
Unfortunately,
I don't understand what you're talking about. This is like a baseline of my conversation every day. But it's also about, even though everything was fine, and okay, if we're talking about as a geeks, I mean, the last word of Harry Potter is everything was well.
Yeah.
I mean, I just don't. There is also meme in Ukrainian part of internet, which is of course more relatable to me. It's like basically my generation is making jokes about. I know that at some point I will be old grandfather, and my grandson will ask, "Oh, father, why you have all of these power banks?" And I will say, "Oh, dude, I have the reason." I mean, like everyone already accepted that we are kind of a fraud. Like it's already there. Even though war will stop, it will never. Oh, yeah, it's hard to say, but it will never stop in our head. I mean, this is continuum. Like this is just, yeah. I remember my friend asked me a couple of days ago. No, she didn't ask. She actually said that to me. That she just scared it will never end. I think this is exactly since I'm a woman, and sorry for this information for everyone. But every time when you feel menstrual pain, this is the problem. You just hope that at some point it will end. But when you're in pain, you feel like it never ends, like never. And I think this is, and then when you ask this question or you think about after war, I don't even believe in after war. Or maybe, okay, I'm pretty sure that part of me will forever stay in the war, and I don't know how big will be this part. And I know for sure with each day this part became bigger and bigger. It just depends. Again, after father passed away, my first question was, will I ever be happy? Because I thought it's not possible to feel happiness. Now I know it's possible to feel happiness, but I just have a feeling that we'll never feel this, light. Yeah, and this is only thing that I think about. And also, uh, I think Romeo, you will understand me in this. After revolution of dignity, after Maidan, it was very cool, of course, like horrible, tragic, but also very cool for our cooperation as a society. And after war, after revolution, you have this moment of decreasing of the hope. You kind of feel like all of these romantical ideas. You can die for ideas, but to work on ideas much more complicated just than die. And I know it sounds weird, but in a way, because this is systematic work of everyone, not heroism of individuals. And I just think that after war, for sure, we'll have the moment when we will feel
Nostalgia, maybe.
yeah. And it was third day, and my friend, since full scale invasion, and my friend wrote me, "I'm so happy." He was doing Molotov cocktail, and everyone in Kiev was kind of thinking that they will invade Kiev right now. And I asked him why. He's like, because it's the same feeling as in Maidan. Like I feel like I'm alive right now. So yeah, I don't know what will happen. It just sometimes I'm feeling like only one thing that I would like to have in my life right now. I can even have a deal with devil or God or gene or wherever. I just want to know the end date. Like even though it's 10 years, I just want to know the end date, because without this point, I don't even know how to plan my life. But again, I have the privilege to not live in Ukraine. I didn't even know. I know that people in Ukraine have very different understanding of timing, of plan of timing. So yeah, I know it's a lot of emotion because like this question was pretty hard to answer, to be honest.
The question of time is something that I want us to, if possible, to sort of reflect upon a bit. And then I'll mention something from my own experience, or specifically from the experience of my parents, that might be of relevance to this conversation. But anyway, go for it.
I have a lot of plans for after the war, but at the same time, I am relatively sure from an analytical standpoint that the moment this war ends, Russia falls into civil war, and we're going to have a whole set of related but still deadly violent problems. And I'm fairly certain in that analysis, because the only way the war ends is Putin dies. That's it. We can liberate every single square inch of Ukrainian territory, and we will. But Russia will still be lobbing missiles at us. They'll still shell us from their territory. They'll still send raiding groups to just murder whoever they can around the borders. I'm certain of this as I can be certain of anything. Maybe it's some pessimism from all of the this year of plus a full scale war, but I am at the same time resigned to a decade plus of conflict because I think at the end, whatever form the end of this war takes, things in the world will be radically different. The politicians trying to kind of cling to this post World War II consensus are aware that things are going to be radically different no matter how this war ends and where it ends, because Russia will be gone. It will either be severely diminished to the extent that bits are just going to start falling off, or it will just end because the Russian state collapses. But in any case, Russia's going to be gone. It's going to be an entirely different state of affairs for this part of the world and the rest of the world. But at the same time, I also have plans for after the war. My wife and I are planning to have children basically the day the war ends. But what that means is really confusing because in my head, I've put it the airplane basically. Once I can fly out of Kiev again, that's when I will consider the war to be over. Once I can, my wife went to Latvia like a month ago or something like this. And what used to be from my house to Riga airport was in total about 4 to 4.5 hour trip because I live very close to one of the airports in Kiev. They had daily flights to Riga. The flight is like 3 hours. So it was really 4.5 hours to completely different country. Now it took my wife about 72 hours ish to go from Kiev to Riga. So I kind of figured once we have that ability to just leave without having to plan out a days long journey, that's when I'll consider the war over. But at the same time, like I said, I don't really think we're going to see an end to the war. Like maybe the airports at some point will start to work again, but the conflict that Russia has unleashed with this idiotic invasion is going to stay with us for basically one of the defining events of our lifetime, definitely this millennium. So it's hard to think. I think this ties into also the way people see time now, because basically everything's frozen. Everything froze on February 24th, 2022. Everything froze. People put aside all their plans. Construction stopped. If you were saving money to buy an apartment, you're now saving money to just make sure you have money that you can use to run away or leave, or maybe you donated. But everyone went into this holding pattern until whenever the war ends. And we were very optimistic in the beginning. It's like, oh, how long could this war end? 3 months. The war will be over by May. Oh, no. Well, it's going to be over before the winter. It's going to be over around February. Now, obviously, we're in April. No one's saying that the war is going to end anytime soon, except for very optimistic military analysts. And everyone's kind of resigned to the fact that we're going to be stuck in this holding pattern for who knows how long. And time doesn't pass. I mean, physically, yes, time passed. It's been a year of war. Things in Kiev, for example, went from curfew at 10 p.m. Streets are dark and unlit. People are palpably tense everywhere. There's stories of saboteurs. You can hear artillery fire and gunfire and so on, to basically normal. A lot of a lot of conversations that I've overheard in Kiev have been people asking their friends who are out of country, "Oh, you could like, why haven't you come back yet? Everything's fine now." Like, obviously, it isn't, but like, it's spring, the restaurants are open, curfew's been pushed back to midnight. The street lights are on, no one is cold, the shops are full of food. Like, yeah, the economy is not doing great, but there's still enough jobs, and there's like a lot of aid for people who need it, for evacuees and IDPs, internally displaced persons, and so on. So, uh, despite this kind of like frozen like moment in time, things are like trying to be as normal as possible despite that. And yet you still, when you make plans, it is for not like next year, the year after. It's just for when the war ends. And it's never clear, and I think it's impossible for it to be clear when that is, that magical time will come when, we can go outside and say, "Oh, thank God the war's over." To be honest, I can't really picture that kind of moment. Like I said, maybe when the airports open, I will have this feeling. But now, even the simple idea of taking a flight is just like this impossible dream. Like, it's 100 years ago, no one's ever flown in a plane before. What is this magical, insane contraption? Like, I've never heard of it. I don't know if that was very clear, but that's kind of
Well,
my thoughts on the matter. They're a little contradictory.
a lot of what you two have just said is familiar to me, if not from my own personal experience, at least from that of my parents. So the airport thing is actually very symbolic in Lebanon. Lebanon only has one airport. There's no, one airport for the entire country. It's in Beirut. And that airport has been, bombed a number of times by the Israelis, by the Syrians, by Lebanese militias, whatever, during the war, and by the Israelis again in 2006. And usually, when the airport opens up again, there is a sense that, or there was a sense that things may go back to normal soon. There was that kind of maybe symbolic sense that this is the case. Another kind of, I think, interesting transportation related tidbit is that Lebanon had a train, which it doesn't have anymore because it was destroyed in the 80s. And that train was never rebuilt after the war, for various reasons that don't really matter here, corruption and whatnot. And to our generation, at the very least those of us who kind of were activists or whatever, the train became this symbol of like this thing that we are completely unable to imagine. Like it cannot cross my mind. Even today, I have difficulty literally doing that work to imagine taking a train between one city and the other. And Lebanon is pretty tiny, which, would be maybe a 20 minutes train ride. And I can't quite picture that. Whereas here, I can take it completely for granted. I can go like 4 or 5 hours train rides in Switzerland, and those are pretty good trains and, pretty stable and whatnot. And so that became something for me that I understood the relevance, or the contrast, if you want, between things that are running smoothly and that tend to be either public oriented, like a train, let's say, or even if it's private, but like it's something that is used by a lot of people, or something like a plane that takes you out of the country, especially and stuff like that, as symbols, if you want, of things being quote unquote okay. And that's a huge quotation marks for okay, because obviously lots of caveats there. The other thing is that you mentioned kids. I really hope this happens. I would be very happy the day it does. Of course, I'll be the godfather and the kids will be named Joey regardless of gender. We all know that. I'm that generation. My mom was pregnant with me the day roughly I was born 4 or 5 months after the war officially ended in Lebanon. So she was already pregnant with me towards the end, because that's when, by 1990, I was born in 91. By 1990, there was a sense that things were kind of quote unquote calming down, at least outside of southern Lebanon, which was still under Israeli occupation. And that's why, like, many of my generation, including myself, are born abroad. I was born in France. And just because people like Lebanese diasporas, especially, were kind of a bit everywhere, and a number of them decided to go back in the early 90s. As part of the whole like post-war reconstruction, a bit of a hope and all of that stuff. what I find interesting is that you mentioned frozen temporality, frozen, that time feels frozen now. During the war, this was regularly expressed. So during the civil wars from the 75 to 1990, this was a very commonly expressed feeling that you can see in movies and literature and just people being interviewed in the press and whatnot, of people having plans for after the war. And in fact, something that I think might be different, that I cannot predict the future, but I think would be different between in Ukraine and the post-war Ukraine, quote unquote, compared to post-war Lebanon, again, quote unquote, is that in Lebanon, a lot of people ended up becoming actually nostalgic for the time of the civil war. Because it wasn't, again, with some exceptions when it was Israel and Syria, most of the rest of that period was between Lebanese and in some cases Palestinian militias. And so you can kind of have a sort of a decent assessment of which place is safe, when might it be safe, and whatnot. There wasn't that kind of complete uncertainty. Again, depends when we're talking about. As you would right now, like Russia is bombing from the skies, right? Like it was a different kind of calculation that people would have. And what kept them going, and I'm thinking of a movie specifically called Phantom Beirut, was the whole, like, I had all of these plans of what I'm going to do after the war. And then in Lebanon, because the post-war was so fucked up, because of various reasons that we don't need to get into now, because of that, people ended up actually missing having those plans for the future, because that future was just very disappointing. Now, I genuinely do not think this is the case in Ukraine, would be the case in Ukraine, because the problem, which is Russian imperialism, colonialism, invasion, and all of that, is very clear. I.e., it's a very clear storyline, if you want to put it that way, between whatever, good and bad, or like between the occupiers and the occupied and that sort of thing. Whereas in case of Lebanon, because it was a civil war, at some point the lines became blurry in many cases. And lots of folks occupied different roles and they changed sides, and it became this thing that we kind of mostly stopped talking about as of the 90s, but very much without actually healing. Like there was a moving forward without actually thinking about accountability, impunity, all of the people who were killed, disappeared, injured, displaced, all of that stuff. And those people are still with us today, of course. And of the people who use the term frozen, they are the ones that still use that term. Like a mother whose child was forcibly disappeared in the 80s, she's the one who says, and I'm thinking of one in particular, she's the one who says time was frozen in 1982 when her child was kidnapped, right? For the rest of Lebanon, generalizing here, time isn't frozen, or wasn't before the most recent crisis, because there was this sort of a separation. Like, I maybe wasn't personally affected, or it's in the past, or whatnot. So there ended up becoming this separation between people who could say that they can move on and people who could say that they cannot move on. And I don't know if your analysis is true that if a post-war Russia, a post-invasion Russia would itself fall into some kind of civil war, then the analogy I'm using, or the example I'm using, may be actually more relevant to their example than to the one of Ukraine that, as I said, has a very clear occupiers, invaders, invaded, resistance, and so on. Kind of a binary, if you see what I mean. I'm not sure if that's the correct term. Yeah, probably that's the correct term. But anyway, this isn't a Lebanon episode. What I'm trying to get at with all of this, really, is that the reason why I and others in certain similar backgrounds, or backgrounds of trauma of one kind or another, to the extent that they've paid attention to Ukraine, which obviously it's not everyone, but those of us who have, I think there is a certain assessment of the situation that's not just rational, analytical, whatnot, but also emotional. And that reaction, from what I understand, allowed me and others like me to have a sense of empathy, if not solidarity, with what Ukrainians are going through. Because even though it's not exactly the same, it's not too dissimilar. It's not like so different that Lebanon went through massacres. There was a genocide attempts and whatnot as well, in Syria as well. So it's like within our recent memory that we're able to see just how bad it is without really needing to go through kind of a political filter, if you see what I mean. So, okay, I threw a lot at you. If you want, I'll give you, if you want to reflect on that, if that's in any way useful. If not, I can move to the next question. Up to you.
I think there's going to be a lot of people for whom time is going to always be frozen. Even whenever the war ends or whatever we're going to call the end of the war happens. Because like there are entire cities that are missing, that are just gone. Like they don't exist anymore. These are cities of hundreds of thousands of people. The Ukrainian government doesn't publish casualty numbers, so we don't know exactly how many Ukrainian soldiers have been killed, but pretty much everyone I'm that I know at least knows at least one person who has been killed in the line of service on the front, in Soledar or Bakhmut or during the Kharkiv offensive or Kherson. Pretty much everyone knows at least one. And for many people, these are going to be multiple loved ones and friends that are just gone. And that's not even mentioning the like thousands of children that Russia has kidnapped, all the families that may spend basically the rest of their lives trying to reunite, because the Russian government, even if it survives intact, it's not going to especially be incentivized to repatriate all of its abducted children back to Ukraine. And it may honestly take people's lifetimes just to track down whatever happened to their kids. So I think whatever form the end of the war takes, for hundreds of thousands and maybe even millions of Ukrainians, they will always be frozen there. Like we're going to be suffering from minefields in Kiev, in the capital district, for decades because everything was mined. Like there are just the entire northern part of the oblast, the province, is mined. And they clear it, but my wife tells me stories every week of a farmer in her village being blown up because they were trying to farm and they rolled over a mine. So regardless of how the end of this war is, time will not move forward, and it's always going to be 2022, 2023, 2024 for I think hundreds of thousands of people.
We know that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, recently issued arrest warrants against Putin and whatever her name is, Minister for Children. Yeah, Minister for Children, Family, something. In Russia, who herself, I've since learned, has like 20 adopted kids, including a Ukrainian who is quote-unquote adopted. This policy of literally kidnapping Ukrainian children to make them Russian, here I'm making, doing air quotes, is so, okay, some conflicts has seen this, so this has been seen in the past, but it's also very specific. China and Xinjiang is the closest thing that comes to mind, but it wasn't quite like that, in the sense that they would send like Han Chinese people in Xinjiang to become the majority and for the Uyghurs, the native Uyghurs, to become the minority. Same for Tibet. But besides that specific example, like as I said, Lebanon was occupied twice by two different countries, Israel and Syria. But there never was a policy of as far as I know, there hasn't been the Syrian state kidnapping Lebanese children to make them Syrians, or the Israeli state kidnapping Lebanese children to make them Israelis, right? Or Israel has been occupying Palestinian territory for like 6 decades now, and they have zero interest in kidnapping Palestinian children to make them Israelis because the entire point is ethno-supremacy and whatnot. What is it about that specific situation that makes it so horrifying besides the obvious fact that children are being kidnapped, which is as horrifying as it gets, but why is it so systematic? Why is it if I can call it an obsession by the Russian state to do just that? Because it's a resource maybe as far as I know, like it takes energy and planning and resources to do that kind of operation, right? And again, no comparison is the same, but the thought that came to my mind, because this is a genocidal act, is how towards the end of World War II, the extermination of Jewish people in the camps actually picked up pace. Like the Nazis were diverting resources from the battles, essentially, which contributed to them losing maybe sooner than they would have otherwise. At least that's the argument. To pursue this ideological, right? Like at the end of the day, it's an ideological genocide. Like they thought this was part of why they were maybe losing the war, or this would allow them, the genocide would allow them to win the war. This was part of their calculations, and obviously that led to their downfall. Why? I mean, how you can explain it, that's up to you, of course, but what is it about the Russian state today, and maybe Putin specifically, and that woman and some other people in the elites or whatnot, that they're willing to really go out of their way to do something this explicit, regardless, or maybe they didn't think of the consequences or whatnot, that now led to the ICC warrant, which we can debate the effectiveness of it all we want, but like it's probably will have some consequences down the line, just in terms of practicality or whatever. But yeah, just how can you explain that, if it's possible?
I think there's two things that's important to have in mind. First thing is that it's very dependent on what your propaganda is saying. So, for example, when you talk about war, and if you talk about concept of woman and war, of course you will talk about rape.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the main thing about do soldiers raping women or not is very dependent on the propaganda. If propaganda is saying that those women are not, you basically make your someone worse if you're having sex with, I don't know, Jew woman or something like that. It will kind of decrease the level of raping, like in Nazi time, of course, because there is propaganda, there is specifically explanation. Okay, no, there is specific attitude towards woman's body, towards body of the enemy. This is very important part of the corporeality and the perception of the body in different political as a political statement. So and this is important to understand why, for example, in some situation there is a lot of rape, in some situation it's less, in some situation there is a I don't know, other sexual violence, not raping, and so on and so on. So why in some situation it's raping, not with the idea to having kids, if you know what I mean, but like other ways. There is always ideological reason for that. Okay, I mean, sometimes it's subconsciously, sometimes it's not, but I have the idea here. And in this case, in case of Ukraine, Russia, of course, this propaganda leads us to the imperialism, and the specifically imperialism of Russia, because it's very different from the imperialism of, I don't know, Great Britain towards India, because Russian imperialism is not about we're taking your land, we're using your land, you are working for us. It's more, we are swallowing you. You are becoming us. And by becoming them, since I know that we with Romeo are not very good representation, but since Ukrainians look very similar, there is nothing that can divide, that are not making you Russian, rather language, cultural language, basically a language. So by the Russian understanding, if you just remove this part of being Ukrainian, you already have Russian person. So I think there is like this point of the swallowing and spreading, like changing the border of understanding what is Russia. It just became bigger, like as every empire, it just became bigger by swallowing other cultures and saying that we are the one. No, we're brothers, we're the same ethnicity, or we have the same religion or something like that. So I think on the base, on as a baseline of these crimes against humanity, basically stolen kids, it's the idea that we can take Ukrainian person, and on the right circumstances, we can make them Russian. So there's two options, and this is very imperialistic point of view. We'll come and civilize you. If we won't civilize you, we will kill you. There is no other like option. And by civilization, Russia sees civilization through their language, through their culture. I saw a very good post. Like I think for us, for people not from imperialistic countries, it's pretty hard to understand how imperialism feel like, because completely understandable, don't have this experience. So I read the post on Facebook. Oh, sorry for referring a post on Facebook, but I think it was very interesting. It was post of from Russian woman, and her partner, apparently he's from Belarus, and it's she was discussing that it's very interesting to have a different feeling towards imperialism, because her partner doesn't have it at all. She don't get it. What does it mean? And again, sorry, but there is a. Do you know who is Yuri Gagarin? Maybe you heard about.
Yeah, Gagarin. Yeah, sure.
Okay. So Gagarin, for the people who are listening, it's kind of first person to who basically went
First
to
guy in
universe.
space.
First dude in
First guy in
space,
space.
yeah.
Thank you. Yes, first guy in space. Yes, he was Russian. His name was Yuri. After that, and a lot of people, it kind of became crazy stuff in Soviet countries, and there were a lot of kids who were named Yuri because there is Gagarin and all of that. So I was reading that post, and there was a phrase when this woman tried to explain to her husband what does it mean to have an imperialistic feeling, and she said, it's like when you're happy that you have the same nationality as Gagarin, that you're happy about it. And this is such a weird feeling for me. Like you're happy that someone else from your country you share a nationality with. Like you're happy that you are from the same culture as Gagarin, as Tchaikovsky, and Tolstoyevsky. I like to call them Tolstoyevsky. I think the Russian culture for them to be Russian is very important part as only the baseline, the platform to be imperialistic. And I think this is for them, this is how they civilize you, like by sharing, sharing or killing their culture. So I can see that from my perception, what they're doing with Ukrainian kids is very similar to a biological experiment on Jew people. Like, let's take Ukrainian kid and let's see how fast or is it possible to Russianize
Russify them, I think.
Russify them.
Yeah, Russify, exactly. And this is possible or not, because this is Maria Belova, this woman. When she was talking about this with Putin, she was like, now I know what does it mean to have teenager from Mariupol or something like that. So, and she's like, yeah, it's pretty hard, but we are moving forward. Like, I mean, she's like kind of showing that it's not very easy. And there were actually also complaining that some kids were like singing national anthem of Ukraine at the very beginning, like, but they were also showing how they're succeeding or on re-educate them or like change the education.
Yeah, they regularly post these stories on the Russian TV. Like it's a very common thing that they're doing now.
The Russians feel like you said, Mariam, the Russians feel they have not even a right, they have a duty to spread civilization. And it's exactly like you said, like either you be Russian or we kill you. Like that's the choice. You're either a barbarian, in which case you're subhuman and we will kill you, or you agree to be Russian. Like that's those are the two choices you get, and the Russians feel they have a duty to spread that to everywhere. That's why Putin keeps talking about Ukraine is an invented nation, and all of these Ukrainians are just Russians who were brainwashed by Gayropa EU neoliberal propaganda. Because this is how they really think. They really think that they civilized this part of the world, and then the Soviet Union fell apart, and the gays and the Jews and the trans and the gender and everything made everyone forget that they're actually just Russian people. And that's why they feel justified and they're proud of all of these children. Like if you go on just Facebook and you like read Russian posts, you'll see so many of them. Like if there's like a shared picture of some destroyed building in Mariupol or whatever, you'll see so many Russians comment like, oh, I feel so bad for all these children. Like I'm so glad that we are so humanitarian, not like those barbarian Ukrainians. We're so humanitarian, we're so civilized that we're taking in these children, we're educating them, because nothing outside of Russia is civilization. It's exactly like the Russians have a very Roman way of viewing the world, where being Roman means being a member of civilization, and being anything else. It doesn't matter how developed your culture actually is, like the history. It doesn't matter. Anything that's not Rome is barbarian. And Russia has the exact same viewpoint. And it's not just Putin or Belovo or anything. It's this imperialist mindset. If like we are a civilization, everything else by definition is barbarism. So when they abduct these kids by the thousands, it's quite literally we are saving them. That's why they're so confused why Ukrainians seem to hate them even more whenever they brag about this, and why they got these warrants in the first place. Like one of the main reactions in Russia to these warrants wasn't even defiance, it was confusion. They could not understand why what they're doing is wrong. They could not understand why everyone else looks at them and sees evil, horrific, genocidal monsters, because in their minds, they're the good guys trying to civilize everyone. They're saving children from war zones. How could that possibly be wrong?
Yeah, I think that's, and also they're obsessed with the idea of jealousy. Like, I mean, world is jealous of them all the time. So basically, Joy, if you will say that you don't want to be part of the nation as Gagarin, maybe something wrong with you. Like, I mean, everyone wants to be as Yuri Gagarin. Everyone wants to have Tchaikovsky in their culture. Like, if you don't want to have that, apparently you are like apparently you're insane. So we should not even count what do you think, because you're insane, because it's not possible. And it's also like it's very important that Romeo said, because yes, they don't get it. They kind of understand. They think that Ukrainians are brainwashed with propaganda, and okay, Ukrainians are like not people. Basically, they're not so smart. But when, as one of the reason how they try to explain why world hate them is by jealousy, because we are bigger. We are a very rich country. I mean, apparently in the perspective of culture.
I asked guests to recommend 3 books, but I forgot to ask you to do this. So if you're reading anything, you can do so. I'll mention one anyway that I've been reading as well, which is of relevance to this conversation. But I wanted to read a couple of things that I've been reading a lot of Timothy Snyder recently. And he had written this book, not Bloodlands, the other one, whose name I'm not forgetting. I think this is from The Road to Unfreedom. I might be mistaken. And so this was before the most recent invasion. This was like after 2014, after Euromaidan and the first invasion. And he wrote this. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014 was a reality test for the European Union and the United States. A reality test. I want kind of to emphasize on this. Many Europeans and Americans found it easier to follow Russia's propaganda phantoms than to defend the legal order. Europeans and Americans wasted time by asking whether an invasion had taken place, whether Ukraine was a country, and whether it had somehow deserved to be invaded. This revealed a capacious vulnerability that Russia soon exploited within the EU and the United States. And he is speaking of Brexit and Trump. And then in another paragraph, like I think a page later, Russia in the 2010s was a kleptocratic regime that sought to export the politics of eternity. And this is something I would like to explore one day. I actually kind of mentioned it a bit now, this idea that essentially Russia is an eternal place. It's, Ukraine is an invented nation. What does that mean? It means that Russia is not, right? Like Putin isn't going all Benedict Anderson is telling us that all nation states are social constructs and whatnot. No, he's saying that is a social construct, Ukraine, and we are not. We are created by God or whatever. Russia in the 2010s was a kleptocratic regime that sought to export the politics of eternity, to demolish factuality, to preserve inequality, and to accelerate similar tendencies in Europe and the United States. This is well seen from Ukraine, as in accurately seen, where Russia fought a regular war while it amplified campaigns to undo the EU and the US. The advisor of the first pro-Russian American presidential candidate had been the advisor of the last pro-Russian Ukrainian president, and here talking about Manafort, of course. The Russian tactics that failed in Ukraine succeeded in the United States, and then he mentioned about oligarchy and stuff like that. that's sort of the point that I would like to end on, at least on my side. It's something that I'm trying to, for to various degrees of success. Sometimes I try to be coherent on this. Sometimes I kind of ramble. But for me, what's happened in Syria since 2011, what's happening in Ukraine since 2014, and especially since 2022, is not just a tragic thing happening over there. How sad, this whole humanitarian lens, whatever. Well, it's not that at all, actually. I mean, sure, it is bad, of course, on a basic human level, but it's also very revealing, right? Like it tells me a lot that when it comes to Syria, that there was kind of a demonization of Syrians across the political spectrum in Europe. And there was a various degrees of whitewashing of the Assad regime, either openly saying like he's defending against terrorists, or almost like kind of the sort of the terms that the apologetics that you would hear towards Putin before, especially before 2022. Like, yeah, he's a bit extreme, but he's reasonable, he can be talked to, he just cares for his country or whatever other stuff. And that for me is a sort of failure that I think, I mean, I might be wrong, but no, that Snyder identifies in these couple of paragraphs as a vulnerability that can then be exploited, right? Like right now we have this entire thing that we're seeing in the US now about should they ban TikTok or whatever because it's a Chinese spy app or whatever. And I'm against banning, to be clear, but what's missing from that kind of entire conversation is that the argument that, well, the Chinese government can use TikTok to influence Americans doesn't really answer the question as to why is it that easy to influence Americans? Why isn't it more difficult? Why isn't it as working Russian propaganda? Why isn't it working in the same way in Poland or in Ukraine, obviously, or in the Baltics, in Latvia, for example, or Finland or whatnot? Why is it more difficult there to succeed in that side compared to how relatively easy it was in the US and UK, thinking of Trump and Brexit here, or in other places? Germany comes to mind, and Austria as well, and so on and so forth. That for me speaks more to certain problems that need to be identified in the West specifically. And that's something that, as someone who's based here now, it's something that I'd like to try and do. So I will, with that in mind, like I will leave you to kind of, maybe give me your final reflections, if you want, on this conversation, on certain things that you think might have changed since the last time we spoke, which is just 4 months ago, of course. But I like doing these things from time to time just to see also the change in our own thought patterns and whatnot. I hope it was of some use to you guys as well. And if you have any book to recommend, go for it. Otherwise, I have one in mind that I'll mention in the end.
This is also interesting. So I think I had very important conversation with my nephew 2 years ago. He was complaining about Ukraine. So basically, if you don't have information about what is imperialism in your school system, and if you will just remove the idea of imperialism, just look at the literature, you will see that without context, without historical context, it just looks like everyone is just complaining all the time. So this is a thing for a lot of Ukrainians. With our old school kind of program of Ukrainian literature, we were just reading and thinking that everyone is just complaining without no reason. And since there is no explanation that there is empire, there is like nobody did that. So, and when you're kind of a teenager and you want to be badass or something like that, of course you're complaining about everything. So my nephew was also complaining about Ukrainian literature, and I was very angry with him. Like basically he's repeating the stereotypes about Ukrainian literature. And at that point I realized, okay, if I want him to change his mind, apparently I need to do also my homework as a civil person, as a Ukrainian. And I decided to check all Ukrainian program of literature with the teacher by myself. Like it basically is a school program that everyone is doing. So I'm doing that right now, just reading that again with my basic knowledge, and it's kind of funny to see what I didn't like, what do I understand now, and how a lot of books in program doesn't align with the age of kids, which is also interesting. So, and for me, the biggest thing right now, of course, I think it's the easiest way to explain Ukrainians for people abroad. And I know for sure he is translated to English. I would propose people to read any, well, not any, but maybe some of the most known works of Taras Shevchenko. This is Ukrainian poet. He basically was first in Europe who started to talk about imperialism and basically talking about the consequences of Russian imperialism. Like it was way before even people even started to talk about French imperialism. He was basically a slave at some point, and he became part of Russian elite. He was part of Russian elite. He kind of changed his mind, and he became Ukrainian elite on purpose. So it was also all of his poems, like there was a lot of very important statements for Ukrainians. And it was very interesting to read that again and just to see how it's like 200 years and it's just again, this nothing changes. And this is very interesting. And I think it's also important. I think my favorite work of Taras Shevchenko, I think, is Dream. It's not very long poem. Just read that. Or it's like just Google the most known Taras Shevchenko poems. Shevchenko is the same surname as the famous football player. Yeah, and I think it will also explain a lot why Ukrainians don't believe in justice right now, because there were no time in history when Russia received any kind of punishment for what they did to us, like history. And I think it's partly also explain why we're so fed up with the world, with the idea of justice and so on. So yeah, that's why I think it kind of will help in a way understand more Ukrainian set of mind.
As for me, I don't know. Closing thoughts. I'm not sure. Our conversation covered covered a lot of ground. But I think that I think it is very important to always remember that the trauma inflicted by war is not something that passes in a person's lifetime or even in a single or two generations. It can take 100 years. I mean, there are plenty of consequences in the world now of wars that happened 100 years ago that still define um, people's lives and that still define the events that are unfolding now. As it always goes, the choices that our ancestors made are playing out in front of our eyes, and that will always be the case because time is linear, moves in a single line. So that's the thought I'd like to leave your listeners with, Joey. But I do have a few book recommendations. The first one, and I think it's especially important for people who want to understand the Russian mindset in these mass abductions of children. It is a book called Suffer the Little Children, Genocide, Indigenous Nations, and the Canadian State. It's a book written by an Indigenous woman from Canada who tackles the question of whether Canada's actions towards the First Nations, towards the Indigenous American population, whether that qualifies as genocide, the effects that this has, and the justifications that Canada, a state that considers itself pretty much the good guy, to the south is this evil neighbor, imperialist America, but Canada is the good ones. But there is this history, and I think this book, you can see a lot of parallels between how the Canadians justified it to themselves, what they were doing to the indigenous peoples, with how the Russians justify themselves in the world, what they're doing to Ukrainians. And I think understanding the parallels there will very much help people understand the kind of historical undercurrents that led to what we see today. Another thing is something I'm just gonna keep recommending everyone to read and reread always. And this is Umberto Eco's definitive essay, Fascism. Eco was an incredibly prolific and brilliant writer. And Fascism is probably one of the most important texts, to be honest, I think, in human history. It's not long, but it absolutely lays out the characteristics that all kind of fascist movements, what Eco dubs fascism, what they mean, how you can recognize them, and you start seeing these parallels again everywhere. And then finally, one thing that I probably should have read earlier, but I read only kind of recently, which is a book by a guy named Mark Galeotti, called The Vori, Russia's Super Mafia, which is kind of a look into the Vori, the Russia's mafia structure. And I think there is no one who is interested in Russia today can fully understand the country without understanding how deeply rooted and entwined the mafia culture is in Russia at the very highest levels of Russian power. Without an understanding of the mafia in Russia, you're just not going to get Russia. You understand how it acts, why its politicians act this way, why its cultural figures act the way they do, why people make moves the way they do. You're not going to understand that without understanding the very, very deep intertwining of contemporary Russian culture with mafia culture. So those are my kind of 3 recommendations for your listeners.
Thanks a lot, Romeo. I would just add, I've been reading this book. It's a bunch of short stories called Love in Defiance of Pain, Ukrainian Stories. The editor is Ali Kinsella, Xenia Tompkins, and Ross Ufberg. And it's just edited, translated from the Ukrainian, I think, for the most part, and has 20 different Ukrainian authors in it. And it's very short stories for the most part, and it's set in different contexts, in the diasporas, or in exiles, Vienna, Brooklyn, for example, or in Ukraine, and so on and so forth. And it's just a nice reminder, not to be too cliche about it, but that war isn't about numbers, and that people are going through actual real things that can be actually understood, even if you're not personally or directly connected to Ukrainian, you're not Ukrainian or whatever, because those are all two human stories, and anyone in that situation would be reacting in the same way, as we now know from the unfortunately huge amount of body of work, of literature when it comes to war literature, quote unquote. Yeah, I don't know, guys. All that's left for me usually at this stage is to thank you both for coming on. Mariam, I don't know if you wanted to throw in a book other than The Lord of the Rings for folks to read, but otherwise we can leave it at that.
No, I think right now, I'm just thinking that if one person will try to read some Ukrainian literature, it will be very interesting, and I think it kind of explains a lot. So nothing, just read Lord of the Rings and Taras Shevchenko. This is a very good combination.
Thanks for that. I would mention that there's an upcoming book by Serhiy Plokhy, I don't know pronounce his name, called The Russo-Ukrainian War: The Return of History, which is coming out in May. I'm interested. I've obviously have not read it yet, but I'm curious to see what it's going to be. So I'm gonna read it when it comes out. Okay. Mariam, Romeo, thanks a lot for doing this. This was very informative, and yeah, as always, thank you for your time. The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Elia Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.